is a guide to the prehistoric and Roman monuments in England and Wales. Let's have a look inside. It's by Chiquetta Hawkes, and it was published in 1954 by Chatto and Windus of London. We start off with this picture. So, this picture is of the Cerne Abyss giant in Dorset, which has been carved out of the chalk. So I've got some more pictures here. This is a Roman walled town at Silchester in Hampshire. Here we have the courtyard type of Iron Age house in Chisost, Cornwall. This is a chalk country hill fort in Beacon Hill, Hampshire, and down here a stone country hill fort in Yavering Bell, Northumberland. Got more industrial in purpose, is of much later date. This is the relatively small rectangular form of which a few examples, too insignificant looking to win a place in the guide, have been noticed in Wessex. They date from the late Bronze Age. Roman villas. These range in size and dignity from large country houses to quite modest farmhouses. They were most numerous and prosperous in the home counties, but frequent enough right across southern England, with noticeable concentrations in Hampshire, the Isle of Wight and the Cotswolds. The most elaborate villas were built around a courtyard, others had a main block with wings. Very many consisted only of a single block, with rooms opening onto an arcaded corridor. Their remains often include foundations of brick or stone walls, mosaic floors, small column bases, hypocaust columns from the central heating system, and of course the usual Roman litter of bricks, tiles and potsherds. The buildings seem often to have been enclosed within an outer boundary ditch or wall, and the estates attached to them must sometimes have been extensive. Roman towns. A very large proportion of the towns which the Roman conquerors established in Britain have been overlain and partly obliterated by modern towns and cities. All were at one time laid out on a more or less regular grid street system. Very often, however, the blocks or insulae were not completely filled with houses. The amount of garden space must have been considerable. Among the regulation public buildings, there was the central market or forum, with the arcaded basilica or town hall running along one side of it, the public baths, and the amphitheatre, generally built on the outskirts. True theatres were rare. The walls and gates, which are frequently the principal surviving remains, were usually later additions to the towns, and as a result may show an irregular outline, contrasting with the rectangular plan of the military forts and camps. The cemeteries normally lay along the road, outside the gates. Town life was already declining in Britain by the 3rd century AD, and excavation has revealed material evidence of this urban decay. B. Military works and boundaries. Hill forts. One of the commonest and most striking types of prehistoric monument is the fort, because very many of them are built on summits. The whole class is often loosely known as the hill fort. These strongholds are abundant among the southern chalklands and also among the hills of the west and north. Very many date from the Iron Age, though in parts of Wales and the far north they might still be occupied in Roman times and later. There are many varieties of hill fort to be distinguished. A characteristic which is however common to most of them is that the ramparts follow the natural contours of the hilltop. Care was generally taken to avoid leaving any dead ground where attackers could approach unseen. In Cornwall, the so-called ring forts are distinguished by regularly planned circular ramparts. Another variant is the promontory fort, in which a coastal headland or steep-sided spur of hill is defended only by ramparts running across the neck. Occasionally, forts lie on level plateau, and there is the absence of determining contours. The usual plan is a roughly rounded one. All these variants may have single, double or multiple lines of rampart and ditch. It can generally be assumed that a fort with only one line dates from the first half of the Iron Age, say between 450 and 150 BC, while those with two or more have been either constructed or elaborated during the second half, from 150 BC to the Roman conquest. Although the plans are similar in the two regions, the forts of the chalk and those of the stone country are very unlike one another in appearance. The chalk ramparts and ditches are often imposing, but they show as mild turf-grown banks. The stone-built walls, on the other hand, have usually tumbled in a rocky confusion, overgrown with heather and bracken. In the single early forts, the chalk ramparts were commonly given almost vertical faces by revetment of timber boards and uprights. In the multiple forms, they often stood as simple banks, though sometimes bonded with timber. Timber bonding was employed also in some of the stone forts, and slots may still sometimes be seen marking the position of the beams. It is doubtful, however, whether in our area any of these forts ever possessed the full elaboration of the stone and wood murus gallicus which Julius Caesar saw and recorded in Gaul. Our prehistoric forts often have hornworks, baffles, and other devices for protecting the entrances. Another protective device was to bend the rampart ends inwards and set the main gate at the inmost extremity, in such a way that it could only be reached by an easily defended alley between the inturned walls. Guard chambers were sometimes built within the angle of these interned entrances. Dikes or linear earthworks. The word dike is used archaeologically to describe any considerable stretch of bank and ditch. Such linear earthworks range in length from small cross-ridge dikes intended to command some upland thoroughfare to such monsters as One's Dyke and Offa's Dyke. There may be one, two, or several lines or bank and ditch, but the longer dikes are usually single. Of their nature, dikes can hardly be regarded as defensible. Rather, they are boundaries. Often they are true political boundaries, marking the limits of estates, territories, kingdoms. A few, however, were more strictly military in purpose, being designed to defend a limited area, like those near Colchester, which ran from stream to stream, protecting the Belgic capital of Camalodunum. Today, linear earthworks often appear to come to an abrupt and meaningless end. The explanation is that when they were built, these ends rested on dense forest or swamp, which made their continuation both impossible and unnecessary. Dikes other than the small cross-ridge type are not earlier than the end of prehistoric times. The Belgae were the first considerable builders. The next period was the late Roman and the sub-Roman, and the last Anglo-Saxon. There are no structural differences to distinguish the works of these periods. In a sense, the Roman frontier of Hadrian's Wall can be recognised as a sophisticated version of the linear earthwork. It probably helped to inspire Offa's tremendous conception of his frontier against the Welsh. Roman forts, camps, and signal stations. During their conquest and throughout the 4 centuries that they occupied Britain, the Roman armies built large numbers of military strong points, ranging in size from signal stations and lookout towers to legionary fortresses, and in permanence from marching camps occupied bastions. Of temporary marching camps, nothing can be expected to be visible beyond the earth ramparts, but the remains of permanent or semi-permanent forts are often far more extensive. In the earlier years of the occupation, even these forts had no more than earthen ramparts and wooden buildings, but during the first half of the 2nd century, very many of them were rebuilt in stone. In these, the masonry foundations of gates and walls often survive, and inside may be seen the monotonous lines of barracks and granaries. In addition to these dreary buildings, normal forts were also provided with a commandant's house and a regimental headquarters, with shrine and treasury occupying a position corresponding to that of the forum in a civil town. A few of the marching camps raised during the conquest can be seen in the English lowlands, but most Roman military remains belonged to the west and north, where the frontier garrisons had to be maintained, or to the Saxon shore in the southeast. C. Industrial. Flint mines. These are limited to the chalk country where shafts could be sunk to reach the natural beds of flint nodules. Apart from the famous centre at Grimes Graves in Suffolk, most mining was carried out along the South Downs, and in Wiltshire. The mined flint was used for axes, adzes and hoes, which were roughly manufactured on the spot. Workshops sometimes being established at the top of abandoned and refilled shafts. Unexcavated mining areas show as a rash of turf-grown mounds and hollows. Stone axe factories. In the mountain country, the equivalent of the flint mine was the quarry, where hard, tough rocks were cut and shaped into implements. Few are known, and they can be detected in the field only by a scatter of unfinished and broken products lying on or near the surface. Copper, tin, lead and iron mines. Tin mining in Cornwall and copper mining in Wales were important industries during prehistoric times. The iron of the Forest of Dean and the Kent and Sussex Weald was exploited in the Iron Age and Roman period, while lead mining was strongly developed by the Romans in the Mendips and the north of England. Yet visible remains which can confidently be attributed to these ancient industries are scanty. Of them all, only the iron mine at Lydney is complete enough to give some idea of the methods employed. The mining of metals has left far less striking remains than the earlier flint mining, partly because it was mainly on the surface, partly because the sites might be exploited continuously into historic times. D. Communications. Ancient tracks. It is impossible to point to any existing trackway and say that it is prehistoric, yet many follow routes which we know to have been in use in prehistoric times. Most of the long upland ridges were established thoroughfares, but they were not artificially improved. Many of them too remained in use in the Middle Ages and even up to the 18th century. For example, the Salisbury-Shaftesbury Coach Road. Famous thoroughfares certainly established marks and other clues. In the south, the metalling of the agger was normally made up merely of compacted chalk, gravel or small stones. Stone paving is found in the north, and there are good examples with stone culverts. Bridges are exceedingly rare, as fords were the common form of river crossing. Roadside burial was a Roman practice, and graves with or without some visible monument may be expected near centres of population. Roman canals. Canals cut by the Romans to link natural waterways in the Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire fens show as a shallow groove between low-flanking banks. The evidence suggests that they were cut early, perhaps as a strategic measure during the initial conquest of the island. The whole system was probably allowed to fall out of use after the 2nd century. Okay, so I am going to leave it there, but I will return and we will begin to read religious and sepulchral monuments. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers, saying I shall see you